Okay, this is going to be the start of the evolution and genetics module, which is going to kind of cover a bit about the history of evolution, a bit about evolutionary processes, and how in recent years we're kind of adapting the field of genetics to further our understanding of evolution. So let's just get into it with some definitions. So a theory in science is a comprehensive and coherent body of interconnected statements based on evidence that explains an aspect of nature. So not a theory in the common way that it's used. In science, a theory is based on evidence, and it's more of kind of a body of knowledge rather than just a hypothetical. A theory is proven by hypothesis testing. Scientific hypotheses must be provable by the scientific method. So we need to be able to test something and determine whether it's true or not. So think about a regular theory. It's kind of just an arbitrary hypothetical, whereas in science, a theory is kind of a statement about something, an explanation of how it works, and then backed up by evidence from hypothesis testing. A famous philosopher called Karl Popper asserted that in science we should aim to falsify a hypothesis rather than aim to prove it. Basically just because falsifying a hypothesis is much easier to do than proving it. So falsifying a hypothesis is basically just proving it wrong. So as an example to kind of put that idea across, imagine if your hypothesis is that all mice are brown. If you were to find a black or a white mouse, then that would falsify the hypothesis, because if you were to kind of prove that all mice are brown, you'd hypothetically have to look at every mouse to its colour. But if you just want to kind of quickly falsify it, you just look for anything that deviates from the hypothesis. So if there's a white or a black mouse, you can say that hypothesis is wrong. Darwin created his hypothesis on evolution. So organisms have all descended with modification from a common ancestor, and this modification is the result of natural selection acting on hereditary variation, as well as genetic drift. Darwin had 4 postulates, or conditions, for his hypothesis on natural selection, and these are basically just preconditions for it to work. He argued that there is individual variation within a species. So if we look at the example I put on the right here, on the peppered moth, you can see a kind of a black and white moth, and you can see a pure black moth. Individual variation within a species would be this difference in colour. We would need more offspring being produced than offspring that are able to survive to breed. So some of the offspring are going to get killed before they're old enough to reproduce. Survival and reproduction must not be random. So basically survival of the fittest, as well as implying sexual selection. And his 4th postulate is that some phenotypic traits must be heritable. So the characteristic must be able to be passed through generations. So if we're talking about the individual variation that we talked about with the colour of the moths, in order for the moth colour to be naturally selected, it would have to be controlled by genes that are easily passed on to the next generation. So this process of natural selection results in individuals with traits better suited to their environment outcompeting others for food, space, and mates, which are all in limited availability. This results in these traits increasing in frequency in subsequent in subsequent generations, until they reach an equilibrium or become fixed traits. So, if you imagine during the Industrial Revolution, where birch trees got supposedly covered in soot, turning them black, so the black peppered moth had better camouflage than the black and white variant, so it was eaten less, it was killed less, and more of these black moths reached sexual maturity and reproduced. Meanwhile, the white and black moths were more likely to die, so they were passing fewer of these white alleles to the next generation. We would expect the allele that codes for the black color to increase in frequency with the next generation, because the black moths are producing more offspring. These offspring are then probably going to outcompete any remaining white and black moth, kind of white-black checkered offspring, continually increasing the frequency of the black allele in the population until it either reaches an equilibrium, where it kind of fluctuates, so the two colours are able to coexist, or eventually the black allele may completely make up 100% of the alleles for that gene in the species, and at that point we'd say the allele is fixed, and basically it makes up 100%. So the allele for the white and black checkered colouring would have gone extinct. Evidence for evolution is found looking at the fossil record, at biogeography and comparative anatomy, and now, in recent years, also by looking at genetic profiles of organisms. Looking at fossils and geologic time, an idea that was fresh on Darwin's mind after he read Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology on his expedition of the Beagle. Darwin used this information, and he was able to piece together a coherent story of evolution. They used evidence gathered from his expedition of the Beagle through the Galapagos Islands. Darwin saw how geographical isolation of populations, for example through the drift of islands from the mainland, isolating any populations of organisms there. This resulted in an altered evolutionary trajectory for those populations, and this is a process that we now call allopatric speciation. So that's just Latin for different country speciation, because the population on the island the islands basically broke away from the mainland. There's no gene flow between the population on the mainland and on the island, so mutations and differences accumulate in both populations, resulting in speciation. The evidence in the fossil record was also present at Darwin's time, although not put forth by Darwin himself. This photo on the bottom right of an ancient Archaeopteryx feather was being used as evidence for the early evolution of birds in the Mesozoic, because this Archaeopteryx feather is specifically a pennaceous flight feather, which we can discern by the fact that it has an asymmetrical rachis, which is the large filament structure in the middle of the feather. So it basically tells us that it was a flight feather, and because we didn't have any fossils of flights of kind of avian birds at the time, this was very interesting. And just a quick talk about the comparative anatomy that Darwin saw on the Beagle. He observed the difference between aquatic swimming iguanas and their terrestrial land iguana relatives, and he argued that the selective pressures put on the iguanas on the island on the Galapagos Islands made them move to the sea.